Hi,
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Good. Welcome to Photo. Hey
Thanks.
guys. Hello, hello. We're gonna hang out for just a couple minutes and let some people keep trickling in. How is everybody doing so far? We good? Can you guys hear me? Uh,
Yep, very
per-
well.
Hello. I'm so excited people are joining. You never know what happens when you just put something out on the internet. All right. I'm going to let you guys keep on trickling in. As a note, I'm going to kind of repeat this a few times, but just as some Zoom etiquette, if you can keep yourself muted unless you have a question, that way any background noise isn't disturbing any other learners that we have in the class. Look at all you people. Hello, hello. Uh-oh, we have a former student of mine in here. Hey, Moy. Dang, look at all you people. This is cool. So if you guys are hanging out, if you need something to drink, some tea, I'm after some tea right now, or any water, you don't have like a pen and pencil or paper, we're gonna start in about 3 minutes. So if you wanna make sure you have whatever it is that you might want, um, go ahead and grab that. For all you lovely people who've just joined in, just some Zoom etiquette. If you can keep your computer on mute, that way other learners aren't distracted. Take it off if you have a question by any means. You can also chat me questions, but once we start a presentation, I'm not going to be able to see those chats. Do, do, do. And also for you guys, I will be recording this. Your faces won't show up in the recording, but you'll be able to access this. I will post a link to my website afterwards where I'm going to upload this Zoom to YouTube, and then any of the photo challenges that I give you guys throughout the class, you can go on and you can read what those are. And then a link to my email if you want to send me your photos to look at, anything along those lines. That way you have another way to come back to this information. Is anybody in their pajamas still? Nice. Awesome. I decided it was a good day to take a shower. Maybe I should look presentable for people on the internet. All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and kind of get started. I think everybody here has heard me say this, but as Zoom etiquette, please keep your camera muted, but feel free to unmute if you have questions. I will be recording this, that way you have access to the lesson afterwards. I'll be posting it to my blog. I'll put a link in my Instagram where you found this. Any of the photo challenges you guys shoot today, you can send your photos to me for feedback. You can send those to me via email. You can send them to me on Instagram. I'm here as a resource for you guys. And we're gonna go ahead and get started. So hello, I'm Lauren. Nice to meet all of you people. It's so nice to actually like see human faces, and as cute as my dog might be, not my dog. I am a food and travel commercial and editorial photographer based in Durham, North Carolina. I am a former high school photography teacher, also here in Durham, North Carolina. I taught high school photography from photo 1 through AP, and those were some wild years, and they were a lot of fun. But ultimately, I just wanted to take pictures, and so here I am living out my dream, as much as it probably hurt my students when I left. Sorry, Moy. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. I am going to be sharing my screen with you. And let's see if we are doing this right. So bear with me, I feel really old these days. I'm gonna hide you guys from my corner, and we are going to start photo school. So welcome to photo school. I hope you think you're gonna look as cool as this dude is when this is done, and if you do, please send me a picture. I'd love to see it. So today we're going to be talking about composition. Both today's lesson and tomorrow's lesson work extremely well with any kind of camera. I don't care if you're shooting with your phone, with a DSLR, with a medium format, with a film camera. These are principles that apply to anything you are photographing. So composition, this is how we learn to train our eye to make artful and storytelling images. I come from a photojournalism background, so most often we have one photo to tell a story and get that point across. And composition helps us do that. So just some tips and tricks dealing with composition off the bat. Always get close. Photojournalist Robert Capa said, if your pictures aren't good enough, you are not close enough. That doesn't just mean getting physically close, but that also means understanding and knowing what your subject is that you're photographing, and fully kind of delving into that subject. The better you know things and the closer you know things, the better your images are going to be. Another tip that I always say with composition is always ask yourself, how can I photograph this in a way I've never seen it before? We're inundated with images on a daily basis, bajillions and bajillions of images a day. And I want you to try and like turn off your brain to those images. Those are great if you're trying to learn tips and tricks, but put some blinders on and just learn to start thinking creatively for yourself. And photograph it in a way that just makes you say, I've never seen it that way before, or gets others to say the same thing. Another tip that I have is you can always use multiple compositions that I'm going to discuss in one image. If you love Mean Girls, the limit does not exist with the type of compositions you can pick and put into your compositions. Do you guys have any questions on any of this so far? All right, remember, if you do, feel free to unmute yourself. I can't see the chat while this is going, but just chime in if you have a question. Uh-oh.
Oh. Hi, I just wanted to ask you on the last one about the multiple composition. Will you give us an example of that later?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great.
Gosh, every one of my photos probably has multiple compositions in it. We'll kind of pick them apart.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So other tips and tricks, make sure you always have a focal point. So make sure that you are telling your audience, this is what this picture is about. There can be a lot of other visual supporting elements in your picture, but we just don't want to like look at a picture and not know what it is that we're looking at. Always double check your background to remove distracting elements. A lot of times we might have like a light pole coming out of somebody's head, or you know, like somebody photobombing in the background. And oftentimes if we just stop and we look throughout our entire frame, we can get rid of those. And then lastly, always focus on your subject and focal point first. Compose your frame around your focal point and then shoot your photo. And if you can do all of this and you don't understand the rest of anything I talk about the rest of this time, you are good. You're smart enough to take good pictures. Your pictures will automatically be stronger images than, you know, if you had a power line shooting through somebody's ears. Do you guys have, unless of course that is exactly what you were trying to photograph. All right, so some visual goals. We're gonna go ahead and dig into the nitty gritty. Visual goals that you wanna accomplish through composition are basic design principles that tell your audience what to do. You are gonna kind of hop into their mind and you're gonna kind of control and direct them to what it is that you want them to look at in your photo. And that is what we're trying to do with composition. Some of these visual design principles that we'll work off of are the idea of balance and imbalance. And I'm gonna dig into each of these more as we continue through. So just a quick intro: balance and imbalance, space, pattern, movement, contrast, and emphasis. Do you guys have any questions before we get going? Cool, let's dig in. So balance and imbalance. Balance will build harmony, or an imbalance will build tension in your photo. It can also talk about where your visual weight is. So if you look on this image, the woman is adding visual weight to the right side of this image, and the left side is left pretty empty and not as heavy as the side where she is. So some concepts that we are going to talk about that help with our balance or imbalance. You can create either, neither is right or neither is wrong. But some concepts we'll delve into are the rule of thirds, which we're going to really get into that a lot. So I'm not going to touch on it too much here. The rule of odds. The rule of odds is that you always have an odd number of things. Having 3 instead of 2 lets your audience know that there is one of those things, typically whatever is closest or whatever is in focus or whatever is visually different from the others, is what we're focusing on. That is our subject. That is our focal point. Another concept we're going to work on is symmetry, asymmetry, and radial symmetry. So symmetry would be if whatever is on side A is equal as to what is on side B. That can create some really nice balance. Asymmetry, like this image, is where one side is different than the other, even though there might be elements that are the same. In this image, if you're looking left to right, it is asymmetrical, but if you're looking top to bottom, it's fairly symmetrical. And then radial is when your composition is kind of based out of the center of your photo and shoots out towards the edges. So think of like maybe a bunch of hands coming into the middle of a table to grab like cheese fries, or a photo of a sun or a mandala or something like that is going to be radial symmetry. And then the last thing that will help build balance throughout your photos is this idea of the golden ratio, spiral, or triangle, which can kind of go whoop over people's heads. So we're going to kind of dig into it a little bit, but I don't want you to fret too much. I just want you to know where we're coming from. So with this golden ratio, golden triangle, or golden spiral, our eye is just naturally pleased by this shape and this ratio. It was used all the way back in ancient Greece when they were building, you know, these monumental buildings. It's also been seen in Leonardo da Vinci's work. It creates balance and harmony, and we're just naturally drawn to it. Our body even follows this golden ratio, which is 1 to 1.68. What is really nice about the ratio, spiral, triangle situation when it comes to visual art is that it helps create movement. Unlike with our phones, you know how we can put up like a screen that has our rule of thirds on it? We unfortunately can't put up this beautiful spiral, or the Fibonacci spiral, which you'll also see it called. But if you just kind of keep this in the back of your mind, if you're placing elements in your photo along this spiral, you are going to start creating movement and you're going to start creating balance in your images. So here's an example of the golden ratio, spiral and triangle. The image all the way to the left is a golden ratio. So if you look, there's some points of interest that are hitting these intersections in the center. We see her hand lightly touching this pomegranate, and that is where our eye is there with the golden ratio. If you look on the golden spiral, we have like this curve of her hair and the hand and the pomegranate that draws our eye through the image, and we kind of end around her eye where the spiral starts to tighten up. And then if you look at the golden triangle, we kind of see how when you break this into these separate triangles throughout the frame, there is something of interest and or breathing room throughout. And on that note, are you guys still with me? Are you here? How are we doing? Any questions? All right. I go really fast, so if you guys have anything, just stop me as I'm rolling. So another design principle that we're going to kind of get into is space. Space can be positive or negative. Positive space is when the area of your frame where visual elements exist. So if you look in this photo of Fries Before Guys, there are visual elements everywhere. There's very little breathing room in this image. Negative space is the opposite of that. Negative space is the area of the frame where visual elements don't exist. So sometimes with with negative space, you can have a lot of breathing room. Both can help create emphasis, balance, or contrast with your focal point. And negative space can give your audience a breather. Pattern is another design principle we'll focus on today. This is repeating elements like light or value, color, shape, etc. within your frame. It can add visual interest to an image, and it can create movement. It can create balance. We have a lot of symmetrical balance in this photo. We just talked about that. And it can create harmony within your image. And if you use pattern with a little bit of contrast, you can have a focal point that really pops out. There's no one single focal point in this image. This is solely just to kind of show you what pattern looks like. You can also have pattern like this. You don't have to have things in such a rigid structure, but you can play with shapes or similar shapes and colors and arrange things in your image or in your frame that will also create pattern. Movement. I love movement. Movement, not like, we're not talking movement like blurring things in your frame or making things, light trails. We'll get to that tomorrow and on Monday. But with movement, you can use pattern and repetition and balance to direct your audience's eye across a frame and tell them what it is that you want them to look at. This can create harmony, or it can create tension in your frame, especially if the direction you're sending them doesn't resolve anything. Like they might just hit the end of the frame thinking, oh, I really wonder what that person who's looking outside of the frame is looking at. And what I love about movement is you can also, just as you can with pattern, emphasize your focal point by using contrast. So in this image, we have this really cool pattern of this background that is kind of chevron striped, and it's directing your eye across, and you're seeing this watermelon that is being bitten. You are also seeing some movement if you're looking through with the way that the watermelon rinds are pointing to each other is also directing your eye throughout the image. So movement is about directing eyes versus actually having a visual movement being seen or frozen in your frame. This one too, if we're thinking about the pearls as our form of pattern or repetition, the pearls are kind of guiding your eye along this edge of this cabbage and saying, okay, wow, look at those leaves, look at that cabbage. Why are there pearls on a cabbage? We have no idea. We're just gonna go with it. But again, it is about directing your audience's eye, not necessarily about freezing action or not freezing action in your frames. Contrast. Contrast is one of our last principles we're going to talk about before we get into the different photo compositions. With contrast, I am not talking highlights and shadows that you see in photo editing tools. We'll talk about that tomorrow with lighting. What I'm talking about is the difference between your focal point and other elements in your image. For instance, in this image with the fish, the focal point is on this tray of dried sardines closest to us, because that's what's in focus. And it is different. It is visually contrasting everything else in this frame, which is out of focus. So you can also do this through light or value. You can do this with color. So say if in this berry image, one of these berries was a strawberry, and that would contrast the rest of them, and that's where our eye would go to. You can also contrast with shape. You can contrast with your depth of field, with how you're blurring things out. These are all things that are gonna allow your focal point or your subject to stand out and contrast the rest of your image. And that's gonna tell your audience what you want them to look at. We're all about being mind controllers with photography. Here's an example of using value or highlights and shadows, lights and darks for me to tell you what it is you need to be looking at in this image. The person in this image is popping off the background because she is in light and the background is in dark. And so that is where our eye goes to. You can also see, if we're going to touch on other design principles, this is an asymmetrical image because she's lined up on the left third of our frame and the right third is fairly empty, so it's visually heavy on one side. And lastly, before we dig into everything, we're going to talk about emphasis. Emphasis is the concept of making your focal point stand out. So any of those principles we talked about, if you're using those to make your subject stand out in the image, you're doing a good job. In this specifically, we're using color to make this tower of pomelos stand out from the background. We're also using space because there's a lot of negative space. So the only thing that is really drawing our attention to the tower of pomelos is the tower of pomelos itself. Therefore, we have emphasis. In this image, we have a lot of pattern and we also have movement, but we have a contrast between this sweet little kid. His name is Marshall. He is not a little kid anymore. He is a grown man. But we have him contrasting all of these turkeys, and that is what makes him stand out through all the rhythm and through all the movement and the pattern that exists in this photo. We're also playing with balance in this photo to make him our emphasis. He is in this top right-hand corner. I'm not really good at my left and right, y'all. Just bear with me. But because he's off-center, because we have a lot of this pattern and he is different than everything else, he is what we're emphasizing. And so we have a stronger image than if he were not breaking up all of these turkeys. Do you guys have any questions on any of those? That was a whole lot of information I just threw at you guys. I'm actually gonna pop out of this real quick and see how we're all doing. How are we doing, guys? I see we have a chat. Great images, thank you. Any other questions you guys might have right now? All right, we're gonna just keep on going with compositional techniques. So with compositional techniques, there are 5 major photo compositions that will help you achieve visually strong photographs and help you achieve your visual goals with design principles. These are, and we're going to dig into these real deep, so if you're taking notes, leave space or just hold tight for a little bit. We have rule of thirds, leading lines, angles, framing, and layering. So rule of thirds. Again, this is probably my most favorite, easy. You're automatically going to have better photos right off the bat. But think about on your iPhone, you can turn on a grid on your photos. Even if you don't have an iPhone, you can do that on your camera as well. But rule of thirds is the idea that we don't just shoot straight into a photo and start reading it visually that way. We don't open up a book and start reading on the middle of page 57 of a 180-page book. That's not how we do things. We read across images the way we read across words. So simply line your subject up on a third of your frame. It can be the left or right third, the top or bottom third, instead of in the middle, and you're gonna start to add more of an interesting element, and that element is going to be balance. Think about placing this giant tic-tac-toe board over your images and picking the intersections to place your subject. This is going to create an imbalance, which will allow for movement, interest, contrast, and emphasis. So here's an example of an image that uses rule of thirds. You can see that our subject here is on this bottom right third. We also have these cool lines in the background that are also kind of breaking up our image into thirds as well. Here's another example of using rule of thirds. So our interest is coming to this man on the motorcycle who is also on the bottom right third. You're gonna learn I really love shooting with the bottom right third in my images, and I don't know why, but that's just where I'm naturally drawn to. And in these 2 images, you can see that the focus, our focal point or our subject is also on the bottom right third. Told you I love the bottom right third. But what all this is allowing for is allowing for us to have some breathing room. It gives us a little bit of sense of place where maybe we didn't have that sense of place if they were just straight in the center of our frame. And it gives us the ability to want our viewers to want more. Okay, any questions so far on rule of thirds? Awesome, we're gonna keep on going. Here's another image that also uses the rule of thirds. If you look, our subject is this pot over here on the top left. Look, I picked an opposite corner. But on the top left, and so we have the majority, the weight of our image is on this left third versus the right third. If you also kind of look and think about what that golden spiral looks like, we have that going on here in this photo with the spiral starting in the bottom right hand corner and kind of coming to this tight little spiral in the pot. So our eye is being dragged along throughout this image, and we're seeing, you know, these eggs and this cream and more eggs and the pot and this dish rag, and our eye is kind of coming to it, and then we're like, oh hey, butter, looks delicious. All right, angles. Angles is a very simple, just like rule of thirds, simple composition that is going to allow you to kind of like level up your images without having to think too much about it. What I love about angles is that it's as simple as like getting down really low or getting up really high and just shooting in ways that you wouldn't normally see. The best thing, in my opinion, about angles is it is an easy way to clean up your background. We've all taken those photos that have really gross backgrounds. There's a lot going on. It's hard to figure out what it is we're looking at or why what we were photographing was important. But sometimes just by moving up a little bit, you can clean up those backgrounds, or by moving down and maybe putting the sky as a background for your subject, you're automatically cleaning up cars or whatever your desk looks like. It's whatever outside your Instagram frame is. So some common angles that we are going to see, if you give me 1 second, guys. I got a notification from Zoom. Okay, cool. We're going. So some common angles you're going to see are direct angles. So that's if you're looking at something straight on, eye level. 3/4 angles. So maybe you're just up 45 degrees looking down, or from eye level, or down 45 degrees from eye level looking up. You can have an overhead angle. You see a lot of food photography is shot overhead. That way we're just seeing the table and not all of the crazy mess that's going on in the background. Or you can shoot worm's eye, which is like if you're down really low, almost as low as you can go on the ground, shooting up. What is really cool about your angle, you can influence the proportion of your focal point by this. So when I used to teach high school, I would tell my students to not photograph their mothers or grandmothers from a low angle, because shooting from a very low angle makes your subjects look quite large and almost godlike. Whereas if you're up at a higher angle shooting down on your subject, you're going to have something that appears much smaller. That is a big reason, I think, why everybody, when they're taking selfies, takes their phone out and puts it up high, and it kind of slims everything down. It's really nice, but also not accurate at all. So on that note, think about when you're using angles, how that's going to influence the size of your subject. Angles create space, they create emphasis, and they create contrast. The one thing I'm going to suggest, though, when you're shooting angles is to stay away from spilling your horizon line out the frame. Unless you have a good reason to. Again, rules are meant to be broken. I'm teaching you all of this stuff so you understand it, and then you can take it and spin it in your own way. But you don't want your audience to be walking around with a broken neck like they were at Barnes & Noble trying to read the spines of books. So try and keep your horizon in your frame as straight as possible, and I think you'll have some stronger images off the bat. Here are some examples of different angles. So here we have a worm's eye view. This is a statue in downtown Dallas. So this is like shooting from the ground up underneath this statue. If you were seeing this straight on, you would see a lot of like pretty dilapidated warehouses, maybe some people walking on the street, a lot of cars going by, a highway in the background. So by shooting it in this angle, we were able to really clean up this image and put emphasis on the statue. Here's another angle. We're shooting from up high, looking down low. This is a woman in Belize who is making some tortillas, and by shooting from this angle, we're putting emphasis on the tortillas. We're putting emphasis on how close her hand is to the comal, which is on top of this fire, and we're able to clean up the background, which was a lot of other women running around trying to cook a huge meal for their village. So again, think about finding ways to capture moments that are going to be clean, but still storytelling. The photo we have on the left of the cactus, this is shot at a very direct angle. So with shooting things on a very direct angle, you can play around with making sure you have really straight, sharp lines. This is a lot harder than you think. A lot of cameras have a level on them now, so you can help get your horizon line straight. I know the phones, like if you're shooting an overhead and shooting straight down, there's a little plus sign that you can match up to make sure that you're perfectly level and not throwing off anybody when they're looking at your photo in the end. The photo on our right, that photo is shot from just down low, just a little bit, shooting up. In this case, when I was photographing this chef, The bill of his hat kept getting in the way. And so the only way I could see his face and see the joy in what it was that he was doing was if I got low and kind of shot up and was able to see his face versus the top of his hat. And here's another image, again, using angles, shot from a really, really low angle right at the ground, shooting up. You can see in the background behind this man, there's a lot of people, there's a lot going on the walls. And the emphasis on the subject wouldn't be as strong if there wasn't a clean space, some clean negative space behind him. So we were able to create that by just getting real down low and shooting high versus shooting at eye level to our subject. Any questions so far? Awesome. Again, feel free to chime in at any point if you have any questions. I'm here to answer them. Leading lines is our third composition that we're going to talk about. So leading lines allow you to direct your audience's eye directly to the focal point. It's a neat way to add a graphic element in to your frame. With leading lines, you can create patterns and you can create movement. Leading lines can be exaggerated by changing up your angle and also getting close. So sometimes you might not see lines if you're shooting at eye level, but you might see those lines when you're shooting down low or shooting up high. Or if you come up really close to a subject and kind of play with sharp angles with how close you are to whatever you're using to create lines. And on that note, you can create lines out of anything, out of streams of light, lines in the road, architectural elements. If you're wanting to shoot food, forks and linens on the tabletop, maybe a knife, any way that you're able to direct your audience's eye to what you want them to look at is considered a line. I mean, you could even use arms or hands if you want to. So in this image, our leading line actually comes up from behind these ladies. And so we're seeing how this line is showing us what they're wanting us to look at. In the image on the left, we have these lines in this park at the London Eye on the ground and with the grass that are kind of directing our eye through this image, and then we get to the London Eye and our eye kind of goes up and around. Because of this, we're able to create movement and we're able to tell our audience what we want them looking at as their eyes travel through this photo. The image on the right with the palm trees does the same thing. Again, the palm trees are creating this line throughout our photo. They're also creating this sense of movement because they're forcing you to look throughout all the images. I have a question, so give me 1 second while I pop on and answer that. No worries, Danielle. I find the link on my Instagram later so you can get the rest of it, but thanks for joining in. All right, so we're going to continue on. Sorry about that. But yeah, so if you follow along these lines that are being created in our images, you're able to tell your viewer what you want them to look at. Again, I told you composition is all about controlling people's minds. In this image, our leading lines are being created by the stairs and by this railing. So they're kind of popping off the background with contrasting colors, and they're moving our eye through this image and up, and we see this person who is leaving our frame. So it's kind of giving us a sense of place, but it's also kind of leaving us with a sense of intrigue, wanting to learn more about this photo, wanting to learn more about this person, but also directing our eyes through what we want them to see in this image. The leading lines in this one are a little bit more abstract. I want you to think about that golden triangle I showed at the beginning and kind of breaking this frame up a little bit. The leading lines we have in this image come from the cloud bank in the sky, which is coming out of the left corner down, which is drawing our eye towards the lighthouse. And then if you also look, these rolling hills kind of have some deep areas of shadow that kind of take your eye and lead it through this gorgeous green grass, all the way back up to the subject, which is this lighthouse. So think about ways in any type of photography, whether it's landscape or tabletop food or portraits, in which you can use your surrounding areas to create leading lines. If you especially love photographing nature or landscapes, you can use roads, you can use trails, you can use trees, you can use mountains to create these gorgeous leading lines that are going to direct your viewer's eye through your photo to get them to look at your subject. Again, another image, these lines of lavender existed, but they're an easy way to guide an eye through this image and get people to stop and look at the person who is gallivanting in the lavender. What a concept that we cannot enjoy right now. And then it's also continuing to guide your eye back to this abbey. So again, try to find lines as they occur around you and figure out at what angles you might need to be at to make those lines really strong and directional, to bring attention to your subject. Any questions on leading lines? No? All right, I'm going to take a sip of my tea because it's getting cold. And I'm very parched. This is the most talking I've done in weeks. All right, so composition number 4 of 5 is framing. Framing, I love. And I love it because you can do a little bit of it in the food world, but it really kind of takes me back to more like of my photojournalism background, where I have to get really creative about how to tell a story with my photo. So framing adds interest and layers by placing your subject inside of a visual frame. Take note, you can shoot through things, you can place frames behind your focal point, and you can place things around your focal point. So if you're looking at me right now, you can probably tell that I framed myself by my 2 bookshelves behind me. But the camera's not shooting through the book frames to see me, but maybe if I take, I don't know if you guys can see this, the top of my water bottle, like you might be able to see me if I do something like this. I'm done being a goofball, but that's the idea. You can create frames out of anything. However, you want to really try to not make it that distracting. Ways in which you can do that, you can get really, really close to elements, or you can kind of back up and see how those frames, how there might be larger frames in which you can frame your subject. That was really redundant. You can also use framing to create contrast, you can create space, and you can bring emphasis to your focal point because you're literally taking them and putting them in a frame. We're naturally, trained to look at things that are framed. So here's some examples. This example on the left, I was able to frame this face by getting really close up on some leaves. Like the leaves are touching my camera. So what that allowed me to do is kind of put a color swath up top to kind of bring this attention to her eyes versus us kind of looking at all this empty space above her. In the photo on the right, this framing is a little bit different because this framing exists around our subject, which is the boat. So we have the boat that is in the center of this canal with the banks on the side and these trees kind of coming up, creating this space for this boat or our subject of the photo to live. And that is how it's drawing our eye directly to the center. Here are some more literal versions of framing. In the photo on the left, you can see we have this couple who are sitting at like a picnic table, and they're centered between 2 trees. There's shadow on top, there's shadow on bottom, and we kind of see them silhouetted in this light space in the center. On the right-hand side, I am shooting through a dead tree to frame this lighthouse. And so we're adding a little bit of visual interest and elements to this empty sky space that we would have had otherwise, while still telling our audience, hey, the important thing you need to be looking at here is this lighthouse. These are sausages, in case anybody was a little confused as to what those were. But by shooting through this like row of link sausage hanging on this rack, we're able to see this worker's face hanging these up to then go take them to be cured. Give me 1 second. We have a chat coming in. Yeah, they're great. All right. Some more ways of framing. I really love on this wild image of this fashion shoot on the left-hand side, again, kind of finding interesting ways to draw attention to our subject by getting up really close to this leafy wheat element that was in the field where we were photographing. So by getting up really close to her, we're able to give this really cool space that draws our attention back to our subject. If you're seeing so far, I wanted to kind of touch on through these images. If you're paying attention, if you look specifically in this next image of the Washington Monument, you can see that not only do we have framing by the like these wooded banks on the side of the reflection pool, we also are creating leading lines from those banks. So our eye is being drawn to the Washington Monument in the center of this frame. In the photo with the girl with the orange croissant on her head, we have rule of thirds. Again, in this image, we also have rule of thirds where she's not quite centered in this frame, but just off to the side, allowing us to see other parts of this image. If you look in these two images, we have, if we look at the lighthouse, we have some rule of thirds with some negative space happening, negative in the sense that we're only looking at the lighthouse and everything else around that's kind of dead. We also have a little bit of leading lines with this because the branches are bringing our attention to the lighthouse. If we look in the photo with the boat in the canal, not only do we have our framing that we're talking about, but we're shooting this at a down angle, so we're able to incorporate other compositions in with the photos that we're shooting. So at any point, if you guys are curious what other compositions are being used, just holler out and we can kind of go through those. But I didn't want to forget talking about that. All right, layering. This is our 5th composition, certainly not our final composition, but one of the most important 5 in my opinion. Layering comes from the photojournalistic world in which you're trying to tell a story with one photo. So with layering, you always want to make sure you have a background and a middle ground and a foreground in your images. Typically, your background is the top third of your image. The middle ground is your middle third of the image, and the foreground, or whatever is closest to the camera, tends to be in the lower third of this image. But that might change depending on the proportion of the things you're photographing. Big tip with layering, always work from your background and move forwards. And this helps ensure that you don't have distractions. If you find an interesting background, like a really cool mural, and then you want to add in, you know, a cool street food vendor that is maybe selling like esquites or elotes or Mexican street corn, and maybe he's in front of this mural, and then you're waiting for some more interest to pop into your image. Maybe you have a person who's walking by that you're able to kind of blur or is out of focus. So you're creating this image by working from your background forwards. And what that does is add a story to your image. It allows your audience to read into your image, and it allows them to decipher a story. These are hard to create in the wild, I am not gonna lie, but they are some of the most satisfying photos when you're able to create images that have really beautiful layers and really beautiful stories kind of tucked in. So the best thing is to find a scene and wait for the interest to come into your frame, although you can absolutely create layering that is completely staged for your images. And in this day and age where we're all staying at home and social isolating, when it comes to the challenge, you might have to create your layers. That is okay. This is an image by National Geographic photographer Sam Abel. He's kind of like the father of creating layers in his images. And so this is kind of how these images were worked through. The top left image is kind of what he saw. This is the overall scene of this branding and castrating of cattle out on this ranch. And he knew he needed to, A, get closer to clean up distractions. He needed to pick a different angle than eye level because, let's be honest, eye level is boring. We see eye level all day long. And then he needed to wait for the perfect elements to arrive into his image. So we see this really wide scene in the top left. We see now in the top right where he kind of got down nice and low. You can see the scalpel hanging out of that cowboy's mouth. You can see the branding happening. You can see other cows being taken down in the back. And then what we ended up with was the resulting image, the bottom, which is nice and large. You can see all stages from the background to the foreground of what it takes to brand cattle on a ranch. So we're able to create stories with layering. In this image, we have a ballet folklorico group dancing. We can tell based off of our background that maybe we're in a city, maybe we're in a park, but they're definitely performing because there's people watching them. In our middle ground, you can see the dancers, and in our foreground, or whatever is closest to the camera, you see this swath of a dress coming up, which is also creating framing around our dancer in the black, and also creating movement because our eyes are following this dress throughout this image. In this image, we have really just kind of two layers. You could count the back wall where there's some light coming through these slats of wood as a layer if you wanted. But really in the back, we have this Mayan woman who is tending to this large pot of soup. We see that her arm is kind of creating these leading lines with this stick that she's using to stir the soup. And in our foreground, we see the woman lower on the comal, and she's making tortillas. So we're kind of getting the sense that these women, they're cooking a meal. They're cooking quite a large meal. If you look at that pot, it's pretty huge. And so we're able to kind of decipher maybe how it feels in this space, maybe how light it is. It's very dark in this space. We're going to assume based off of these fires and all this steam that is rising that it's very hot. So we're kind of, layers give us a sense of place. They give us a sense of, time. They give us a sense of location. They help lend a story to something greater than, a picture of an apple on a white background. No hate on apples on white backgrounds. I think they're gorgeous. Here's another image in which we're utilizing layers. You can see these pastry chefs working in a kitchen, and your eye kind of travels between the three of them. You can see in our background, we have like that stainless steel backsplash you see in professional kitchens. And as you move forward, you see pastry chefs hard at work. And in our foreground, closest to us, is this pastry chef in focus as she's whisking this huge pot of cream. We also have framing in this photo. Our center pastry chef is framed by our two chefs on the outside. We have rule of odds in this photo because there are 3 of them, not 2 and not 4. So we know where our attention is going to. We know who we are looking at. You know who the photographer is telling you to pay attention to, but they're supported visually by the other elements in this photo. This is pork. If that is a trigger warning, probably should have let you know that. I apologize in advance. If there are any more images, but I don't know if there are. But here we are in a pork processing plant here in North Carolina. You can see the workers are creating layers. In our background, we have this worker in the back whose eyes are directing us to the worker on the right, whose eyes are directing us to the worker on the left, who is reaching into a bin to grab a slab of pork to then butcher and process. So through this image, we're able to see kind of what this process is and what this space looks like and what it is they're doing, versus if we were just close up on this pork or close up on their hands. We're also at a low angle here. You can see that the camera is lower than eye level and is shooting up. It's kind of giving us this sense that these men might have an important job at this pork processing plant. It's also creating lines and some leading lines with these carts that are carrying these ribs. Again, I apologize if anybody is queasy. But the idea is that you can combine multiple compositions in this photo. Same thing with rule of thirds. If you look, our gentlemen both on the left and right are lining up on those intersections. So we're able to kind of create a very balanced image with our rule of thirds. This is a photo that uses layering in addition to a lot of negative space. So in our very far distant background, we have the Shanghai skyline, and in the center or the middle of our frame, you're seeing the Bund, which is this wall with all these flowers, and in our foreground or closest to the camera, you're seeing people just kind of walking by, going about their daily life. So you can also create layers that give a sense of space and scale and size by just backing up and kind of looking at the whole thing. Do you guys have any questions so far on any of that? I know layers can be a little difficult to grasp.
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah, go for it.
Would you recommend using focusing or layering to take photos of food or like a dish?
I think if you're taking photos of food and you're utilizing layering, shooting that photo at like a 3/4 angle or a direct angle is better than overhead. Because if you want to create layering with food or like a tabletop scene, you could create it by maybe having, you know, your dish could be the main focal point and maybe there's some height to that dish, but then you might have like wine glasses in the photo, and in the background you might see people's hands serving food or clinking their champagne glasses. You can create stories and layers using food. You just kind of have to be a little thoughtful and a little creative on how you're able to do that. It's easy if you're working in a kitchen or you're photographing like an event surrounding food, but you're right. It is a little difficult to create layers with tabletop food, but it is doable.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions on layering or any of these other compositions we've discussed so far? No? All right, we're going to do a quick recap. So, number 1, get close. Get close to your subject, but also get close so that you know what it is that you're photographing. Like, get close. That's about all that I can tell you guys. Don't use the zoom function on your phones. Really, they don't use them. They suck. Take your feet and walk and get close to what it is you want to photograph, because you're going to get such a higher quality image. It's kind of mind-blowing sometimes when you think about that. Always think to yourself, how can I shoot this differently? Get off Pinterest, get off Instagram, get off Facebook, get off Google Images or whatever other thing that is full of images, and just think about how you can shoot something in a way you've never seen it before. And in a way that might get people to think or ask questions. Always have a focal point in your photo. People need to know what it is they're looking at, and compositions help you direct them to that. Look out for distractions. Again, pay attention to your background. Do you have, a random stop sign in the background? Do you have a, crumbs on your surface if you're shooting food that you don't want to have there? Think about how all those things affect your overall composition. Composition is kind of like controlling your audience's mind, because you're using all these tools to direct their eyes to look at your focal point. Always keep the grid on your phone camera up. I don't know if you guys can really see this, but now you're probably seeing it on my face, but the grid is up on my phone. And that's an easy way to ensure that you can get stuff lined up on your rule of thirds. You can keep lines straight. You can kind of follow the Fibonacci golden spiral by having that grid up. And then it allows you to know the intersection points where you can place things. If you're not shooting on your phone and you have a camera, you can do the same thing. A lot of cameras, you can pop that grid on the LCD screen, or sometimes you can even pop it up in the viewfinder. Sorry, I'm losing my words. And you can always, and I encourage it, use multiple compositions in your photos. You'll probably end up having multiple compositions in your photos, even if it was not intended. So if we have to put this in a sentence, I want you to utilize your rule of thirds, angles, leading lines, framing, and layering to achieve balance, space, movement, contrast, and emphasis in your photos. Now, let's try composition. Typically, when I teach this, this is a very interesting space in which to teach photography. But I go through each composition, and as we finish each composition, I send my students out to go take a quick photo using rule of thirds or angles, and they come back and we kind of talk about it in like 3 or 4 minutes, and then we move on to the next composition. Unfortunately, I can't do that here. But I did come up with a small little scavenger hunt that you all can try. So here's some rules for the composition challenge. Always have a focal point. Use a composition if the challenge is design-based, or vice versa. For example, the first thing on this list is salt and pepper shakers with positive space. Well, I'm just giving you a design, a principle of design here, positive space, but you can shoot those with layers. You can shoot those at an angle. You can shoot those rule of thirds. I want you to pick your composition with that. Try to shoot in well-lit areas. So tomorrow we're going to kind of touch on lighting, but if you're shooting these, think about shooting them during the day. Go find a window, go outside if you can. Maybe you want to make your own light and you have some fun flashlights hanging around, but make sure what you're photographing is well lit. That will also ensure that your photos aren't blurry. And number 4, please practice social distancing while you're doing this. I do not want to be responsible for you getting sick. I tried to keep this scavenger hunt in mind with our current global pandemic. So please don't get yourself or anybody else sick while doing this. And number 5, feel free to tag me on Instagram or use hashtag LVA Photo School. Or you can email me your photos, which I don't have my email on here, but I'll give it to you. It's just Lauren, LAUREN, at laurenvallen.com. and I'm more than happy to look at them and give you guys individual feedback. If you don't send me your images, I'm not going to know that you shot them, and I'm not going to be able to help you any further. So please make sure you send me your photos, and I'd be more than happy to help once you send them my way. So I'm going to go over these lists and kind of describe them, and know that they're completely open to interpretation. So number one, salt and pepper shakers with positive space. If you don't have salt and pepper shakers, come up with something out of your spice cabinet. That's fine. Number two, fruit with negative space. If you can't get fruit because we're in a global pandemic and people hoarded all the fruit in your grocery store, maybe beans. I don't care. Pick something and shoot it with negative space. Portrait of a pet or person that you might be with, framed. So use framing to create a portrait of a pet or person that you're stuck with. I want you to create a centered composition with leading lines, because remember, we learn our compositions to then break them. So think about how you can use leading lines to bring attention to something in the center of your composition. Create layers with a window. And we have a question. Let me answer that real quick. Adios, Olga. I hope you're doing well. Look for the link in my Instagram profile later today. All right. And then, where were we? Layers with a window. Use a window in your house or your apartment or your flat or wherever you're at to create layers. It doesn't have to be a window to the outside, although it can be. And if you're in a space where it's safe enough to go outside, get some fresh air. Let's see. The next one is self-portrait with rule of thirds. Please get creative. Please do not send me selfies, but please also use the rule of thirds in this self-portrait. The next one is pet's perspective of the outside. If you don't have a pet, think about maybe what a young child might see, or whatever pet you would imagine having in your house is doing. I have a very tiny dog, and she probably lives all but 8 inches off the ground. So I'm just going to get really low with my camera and see what I can photograph from her perspective. Although she does like to climb on the back of the couch, so she gets a little bit of height. The next one is break a pattern with contrast. So think about the image of the kid and all the turkeys. Think about a way in which you can have this pattern and you can break it up with something that is different. This can be an image that you're just creating. It can be made with food. It can be something you find on a walk outside. It can be something in your house. Whatever you want, but pattern broken up with contrast. Also, make sure you're using rule of thirds or layers or framing or leading lines to create this one, because this is a design based without a composition. Our ninth one, let's get up close and personal. I want you to try using framing or layers with a portrait. This can be a portrait of anybody that you're around. It could even be a self-portrait. But in the image that I showed you of the green leaves that were super blurred out around the subject's face, where you're getting really close up to something like that, or not, or backing off and using those framing elements as layers in your portrait. And then lastly, I want you to visually interpret the word blue with angles. This was a challenge I had centered around the word blue, growing up, going through school, then continuing teaching when I was teaching high schoolers, and now as I teach workshops. I don't care how you interpret it, whether it's the color blue or the feeling blue or something blue, or how you're feeling, but visually interpret the word blue with angles. And I'm going to be putting this up on my blog, and hopefully I can get that blog live by 5:30 Eastern time. I'll also put that in my Instagram story. So if you guys want to screenshot it there, that way you have it on your phone as you shoot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you guys. How is everybody? Good, good. Hey, Michelle. Hello, everybody. Well, cool. That is composition. That was a whirlwind. Thanks, Tara. That was a whirlwind of a lesson. But I want you to know you can always shoot me a message on Instagram. You can always send me an email. And I'm really looking forward to seeing these photos from your composition challenge. Again, I'm putting all this up on my blog so you can have all those notes and access to kind of what I taught today. So you can have those in your back pocket for whenever you need. And if you're coming to class tomorrow, tomorrow we're going to be talking about lighting. So natural lighting versus artificial lighting versus window light, and how you're able to create strong images with light, because if there is no light, there is no photography. So on that note, guys, if you don't have any other questions, I will see y'all later, and feel free to send something out to me on Instagram if you do. Bye.